Okay, I think we should be good to go. So hello everybody. I am here to present some stuff I've been working on some shot distribution and goalkeeper handedness. The title I originally put in was a goalkeeper handedness, but actually it turned into more of a handedness as a general thing than goalkeeper handedness. But yeah, moving on. A little bit about me. I'm an earthwell physicist. I started off in life as a research physicist, and then I wandered off into the legal profession. But I got into kind of hockey analytics as a way to keep going with my coding skills, and I kind of never climbed back out of that hole. I am a Stars fan, so I am an often frustrated hockey fan. I do a bit of blogging about the Dallas Stars for a local sports site here in Texas, and I am a usually sunburned Scot in Texas. You might be able to tell that this is not a Texas accent. So why did I get into this work? So I started noticing some asymmetry in shots, and particularly expected goal models. It came up a couple of times at the CBGHAC conference in Columbus. I noticed a couple of presentations where there seemed to be some asymmetry on expected goals and shots on goal. And it was particularly obvious in the hackathon presentations that used the SportLogic data and their in-house X-goals model. This is a particularly rich data set, much more so than the NHL play-by-play data. I also noticed that again when Micah presented his new Magnus 3 model at one of the HANAC sessions a few weeks ago, and it really brought the question back to the forefront of my mind that had been kind of lurking there since CBGHAC. What's causing this, and can we see it in the NHL play-by-play data? Is it an effect of goalkeeper handedness, of player handedness, or both, or is there something else entirely going on? So what did I do? I scraped all of this season's games using the R-scraper written by Josh and Luke Youngren of Evolving Hockey. That was just over 1,000 games, 1,041, I think. Because R isn't really my forte, no judgment, I wrote all of the data out into a giant CSV file, and then I read it back into Python as a pandas data frame. I'm much more comfortable using Python, personal preference. I then started breaking out and analysing the data according to goalie handedness, player handedness, shot type, shot location, etc., to see if anything statistically stood out. One thing I did notice was that the Avs were kind of an interesting case study. Their two main goalies, Gruber and Francouz, They had a relatively similar number of games. And like most goalies, Gruber catches left, while Francouz catches right. So I dug a bit more in detail into the data on the Avs to determine if there was a difference in where the goals went in the net, and whether there was a difference in the shot trajectories for each of the goalies. One caveat is that we do have a comparatively small amount of data points for right catch goalies. There's not very many of them in the league, and they played a fairly limited number of games. Francouz played by far the most number of games of any right catch goalie, so the data is quite noisy. Just a note on player handedness. There are only actually 6 goalkeepers who played at least one game in the 1920 NHL season so far that catch right. That amounts to about 7% of goalkeepers. The vast majority of keepers catch left. So the 6 goalkeepers were Francouz, Peterson, Hutchison, Domingue, Lindgren, and Sen. And only Francouz, Hutchison, and Domingue played double figure number of games, with Francouz playing by far the most at 35, Hutchinson and Domingue played 16 and 17 respectively. The vast majority of keepers do catch left. This seems to be a combination of the low number of right-handers in the population as a whole. I think it's about 10% of the general population, lack of right-handed goalie equipment at a young age, etc. The majority of skaters shoot left for a similar reason. There are more right-handers in the population, which leads to more people shooting left. This seems to be much more of a personal preference. However, because around 36-37% of skaters shoot right as opposed to 7% right catch goalies. As a personal aside, I did an unscientific poll of my local beer league, and in fact we have more people who shoot right than shoot left. Just about 60% of the league shoot right. I'm not really sure why that is, but I thought it was quite interesting as someone who is a right-hander but shoots left. So maybe it's not that surprising that as we saw with the image from Micah's talk I showed earlier, that shots are slightly weighted to the right side of the rink from a frame of reference of a player shooting a goalkeeper. If you imagine people getting more central to the goalie on the left-hand side of the shot, on the left shot, then that would take them up the right side. But does the handedness of the goalkeeper make any difference? So the first thing I did was I broke out left and right catch goalies in total. I didn't break this down by play state or anything. I only excluded things like empty nets and penalty shots. And I broke the rink down into 4 areas that effectively were the left outside of slot, the left slot, the right slot, and the right outside of slot. Breaking out the different types of shot by left and right catch goalies, there wasn't a huge difference in shot distribution between left and right catch. The only really significant difference was on wraparound shots, but we had a small number of those for right catch goalies. You could conceive why they would be different, but the data's noisy enough that I wouldn't really have any confidence in that result. What we do see is that with slap shots, they are kind of reversed in that you have 49% on the left side of the rink and 51% on the right side of the rink for left catch goalies, and 51% on the left side of the rink and 49% on the right side of the rink for right catch goalies. Wrist shots have exactly the same distribution, regardless of whether the goalie is left or right catch. That's 53 to 47, left to right. Snapshots again have kind of reverse left-right distributions depending on left and right catch goalie, and the same with backhands. Tip-ins were similar distribution. Wraparounds, as we said, there was the vast majority of the shots came from the right side on right catch goalies, but there were only 33 shots in total. So then I looked at the goals. As before, it was broken down into 4 areas: left outside of slot, right outside of slot, and breakout by different types of shot, and left and right catch goalies. Again, there wasn't a huge amount of difference. Only significant difference was really seen in the noisiest data. For slap shots, it seems like far more slap shots on right catch goalies from left side, but the numbers are small. However, given that the shots were distributed fairly similarly, it's an interesting feature. The wrist shots, it follows the shots in that there is a significant weight to the left-sided shots for both, but there isn't a significant difference. Snapshots, the goals were actually reversed relative to shots for right catch goalies, so we had more shots from the right side of the rink, but more goals from the left side of the rink. And tip ins, as we noted before, we had a very heavy weight to the right hand side for right catch goalies, but actually the number of goals was only slightly weighted that way. I did a quick conversion, so the number of shots from a particular type and of a particular type and location that are that turned into goals, measured against so basically a kind of rough likelihood of goal score from that area. We see there's not a huge difference. The only significant differences are seen in the noisiest data. The slap shots from the right hand side seem rather more successful in right catch goalies, and snapshots seem rather less successful. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the best chances of getting a goal come from the shots in the slot. This seems to be a slightly to the right hand side of the slot, particularly for the left catch goalies. So the majority of goalies in the NHL, there seems to be a slight advantage to shots from the right hand side against them, which might account for some of what we're seeing. The average conversion for both left and right catch is about 10%. So as you can see from the slot area, we had quite a significant positive above that, and for the wide angle slightly less, which again is what you would really expect to see. So I didn't see, as we say, a huge amount of effect from the goalie handedness. There does seem to be a small amount of bias on the right hand side of the rink for left catch goalies, but not anything hugely striking. So I started to look at the player handedness, and it seems like so I broke out left shot players on left catch goalies, right shot players on left catch goalies, right catch goalies left shot, right catch and right shot. It seems like players attempt more shots from a wide angle on the right catch goalies. I'm not really sure why that would be. I'm not really sure why that's the case. I mean, the data is noisy, so there just might be something weird going on there. But what we see is that left shot goalies on left catch, we see a little bit more on the left hand side, and right shot on left catch we see more on the right hand side. That might just be to do with where those players are playing on the wing. And for right catch goalies, the left shot and right shot were actually distributed pretty 50-50. In fact, exactly 50-50. So yeah. So in terms of goals, however, we see more goals from left shot players on the right hand side of the rink. It broke out about 48-52. This again is probably due to this is quite probably an example of an off-wing effect. The player gets their stick more central to the goal and increases their chances of scoring a goal. As well, right shot players are also slightly more heavily weighted to the right hand side of the rink. That broke down about 49-51% on the right hand side. Left shot players on right catch goalies, again, we see we see 46-54 left-right split, and right catch, right shot, we see a 49-51 left-right split. So I think what we are seeing here is the kind of there's a bias to the right-hand side. If you kind of think about how shots are goals are usually kind of scored on an angle, that probably makes sense. And against, you know, the most left catch goalies, players don't come up against right catch goalies that often. So, you know, it's not perhaps not surprising that they would not change their shooting patterns against right catch goalies. The strongest effect is for right catch against left shot against right catch, but you know it's pretty similar overall. And certainly for left shot players, this seems to be an example of an off-wing effect. You know, someone asked me on Twitter whether I thought that what we would see was players pulling their stick to the inside and shooting on the off wing, and that seems to almost certainly be the case here. Certainly in terms of goal scoring success, less so in terms of overall shot distributions. So as I said, are we seeing an example of off-wing effects? People argue that this can provide a positional advantage. For shots taken, not so much. It seems like 49% of shots are taken on an off-wing side, but we definitely see an off-wing effect in the goals scored. 58% of goals scored were taken by players on their off-wing side, so that's quite a significant effect there. Just quickly, I did a tracking case study on the Colorado Avalanche. Francouz and Gruber had not too dissimilar stats overall. They're playing with a similar team in front of them, similar coaching structure. So, you know, as much as we can control the variables in a game situation, it was a fairly good test. I tracked all 170 odd goals against the Avalanche to determine whether the shot went into the net, and I combined it with the NHL data on shot location to determine trajectory for goals. And the way I broke it down was like this. So I broke it into 5 areas: left hand high, left hand low, 5-hole, right hand low, right hand high, and we also had empty nets and penalty shots. And what did I see? Well, I saw an awful lot of this. This sort of thing. Here we have Sidney Crosby passes it to Getzel, who is a left shot player. He's on the right hand side. He shoots it across and into the net. Again, we have a similar here. LR pulls it to his left side and into the net. And this was basically a pattern that repeated itself over and over again. I've got a couple more here. These first 3 are against Gruber, and the final 2 we have here. Again, this was from the left side, but it was pulled over to the left shot. This is against Francouz, so a right catch player, and again right side, left shot, left hand side of the net. And finally, we have another one, right side, left shot, left hand side of the net. So that was really the main thing that we saw when I looked through all of the goals. I saw that pattern over and over again. So when we plot the goals conceded, we actually, in terms of the positions where the goal went into the net, I expected to see maybe a little bit more of a difference between a right catch goalie and a left catch goalie, but I didn't. They were actually pretty similar in terms of the goal. You know, from the skater perspective was from the left hand side. Most goals went into the net. From the goalie's perspective, the right hand side. Gruber seems slightly more likely to concede goals on the low stick side, and actually so did Francouz, which is 2 on this graph for Francouz and 4 for Gruber, but overall pretty similar distribution. Both were also more likely to concede on the low glove side than the high glove side. So maybe going bar down high glove side was not the play to make here. In terms of plotting the shots, we see that for goals conceded by the goalkeeper on the left high side. Majority of goals on the left side. The left low side seems to come from the right hand side of the rink. There's more distribution on the left high. That seems that the right hand side of the rink shots seem to be in the majority. A lot of the shots from in the low side of the net come from the slot area, and on high side shots seem to come from further out. They tend to be more of the slap shot type shots. In terms of the right hand side, again, or rather, we seem to have a fairly significant bias to shots from the right hand side of the rink, and they seem to be from slightly further away than the left hand shots. This is probably down to angle as a factor. I haven't done any calculating of angles. It's maybe something to look at in the future. But you know, it's at a sharper angle than on the left hand. So you can kind of see why it would be taken from further away. On the 5-hole against Gruber, that seems to come mostly from the left hand side. On our Francois seems to be slightly more from the right hand side. I wonder if this is something to do with getting the puck under the glove. But again, I haven't looked into this in too much detail, but it might be something that's worth looking at. So just to conclude, I say to determine if there's any effect of goaltender handedness on shot and goal location. There appears to be only a small effect caused by the goalie handedness at best, but the data on the right catch goalies is from only one season's worth of data, or less than one season's, as we're currently suspended, is pretty noisy. The analysis of the Avs suggests that against their goalies, at least, the low six side is a fruitful area for shots. But the direct comparison overall of right and left shot goalies from the same team gives a similar distribution. It appears to be heavily tied to the shot location. There does seem to be a significant off-wing effect, particularly on the right-hand side for left-handed players or left shot players. This is, like say, probably due to the majority of shooters being left shot shooters. And it's consistent with the findings, earlier findings on off-wing effects by Parnas and Kane. So kind of what we expected. So that right bias seems to, in expected goal models, seems to come a little bit from off-wing effects on left-handed shooters rather than anything to do with the goalie primarily. And that's all I have. Any questions are welcome.
Okay, coming in, I will just ask questions because the issue at the moment is we have a minor lag issue occurring and the stream's a good couple of minutes behind us. Oh. So they're still getting stuff and now they're hearing me talk about it. But like going forward, I guess, is there Okay, hello and welcome to the manual tracking roundtable. I think we have fixed maybe the internet issues. We'll see, but well, I just double checked that's all working properly. Do we maybe want to go around and just all introduce ourselves and why we started doing the slightly crazy thing that is manual tracking?
Hi, I'm Corey Snyder. I started doing data tracking in college for hockey games because the lockout happened. And I thought it'd be kind of a fun project to do during my senior year because I didn't have there wasn't a whole lot else going on as far as like sports go. So I started doing that, and it kind of took off a life of its own. I was reading a lot of Eric Tulsky's studies with zone entries, and scoring chance tracking was a big thing back then. This was like 2012. So there was a big movement for this kind of like manual tracking thing back then, and it was a lot simpler. And I started doing it kind of just on my own time, and people were interested. I did the playoffs one year, and that kind of took off. And next thing I know, it just kind of became a job of mine.
Well, I started tracking because Corey started tracking and showed a path to doing it and showed the value in getting more data than what we were getting publicly to answer what I think are becoming the right kinds of questions to ask about the game. So I owe all my joy and pain to Corey.
I'm sorry.
I still love you.
Yeah, and I joined Ryan Stimson's passing project back in 2016. I don't really exactly remember why. I think it was just over kind of a tweet, and then I connected with Ryan, and it was like February vacation. I was still in high school. And then it just took off from there, and it's just something I basically do every day now.
Nerd.
And for context for me, I got really mad that there was no stats pretty much at all for Australian hockey at that point in time. Like, we had our box scores and everything. But I'd really gotten into advanced stats as a way to validate what I was seeing or couldn't see, because the horrifying things that I don't exactly talk about too often, my eyes don't track properly. So I can't actually follow the puck. Which makes what I do a little bit more insane, because a lot of it's reading players' body language and kind of guessing where I think the puck is going to be and just hoping the little black spot appears where I think it's going. And I can be like, okay, good, there it is. And even like, with shots and stuff, reading goalies, just to be able to see, did they save it? Where did they save it? Where did it go? And everything. So I was really mad that there was no anything that resembles an advanced stat in Australian hockey, because I was like, excuse me, how am I supposed to know that I'm like seeing the game correctly? And I kind of just went from there. I guess next up is everyone has very different processes. I feel like manual tracking is a super unique thing. No two people's stuff looks the same. Even if you like teach someone how to do it, it gets destroyed beyond belief within like 5 seconds. So it can be the exact way you want it to be. What does everyone's kind of process look like? And how do you go about, I guess, tracking things?
I'm a bit old school with mine. Like I used to do it longhand with zone excerpts, like with a sheet of paper. I do not do that anymore, thank God. But like I'm tracking 3 types of stats when I'm doing games. So I like keeping everything on one screen. So what I do is kind of just minimize the Excel sheets that I use for tracking and put them in the negative space on NHL TV. So everything is just like right there. And ever since I got a touchscreen laptop, it's been a lot easier for that because I can just kind of toggle back and forth a lot quicker. So I like keeping everything like right in front of me. I don't like going back, and I don't like rewinding the play a lot, just because I like to kind of get as much done as I can. But basically what I try to do is just keep it as simple as possible, just keep it really streamlined. And another thing is making the codes very simple and quick. And I also try to make things faster. Like recently, I don't like kind of wasting time entering things I don't have to. Like the strength, like the game situation. Like if it's 5-on-5 all the time, I'll kind of just drag that into the entire cell or the entire sheet and just change it if I need to, if there's 4-on-4 or a power play. So that's kind of made things quicker. So just keeping it as quick and like brief as possible is the key for me.
Yeah, it depends on what I'm tracking. There's some stuff that I do still track manually because I'm at a game watching the game. I'll track exits and entries that way. And I use the tracker that Alyssa has built to track on ice events, which is really handy, and use her tip to use color coding there. So I use a lot of visual cues in my in-game tracking. But then if I'm doing post tracking where I'm watching video, I really like a 2-screen setup so that I can see a full view of the game, switch camera angles if I need to, have my Excel sheet on the other. I'm also sometimes clipping GIFs at the same time for use in an article or a story like that. So I'll have that with my Excel spreadsheet. And then I took Corey's tip of copying and pasting similar data. And sometimes we've had access to tracking software. And so if that's the case, I'm usually just using that where I'm tracking coordinates on like a virtual rink. So I can later map passes or shot locations or passing sequences or stuff like that. So it really depends on the project that I'm tracking.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it also kind of depends on the project. Like sometimes I need, like a web application to like track locations and whatnot. A lot of things I do are just kind of in Excel, like, you guys, because it's just kind of easier. And especially once you get into a rhythm, you're tabbing through the different cells and whatnot, it's a lot faster. I think like one time I tried like add a game to track live, and then I gave up on that like halfway through the first because I was just like, I'm kind of missing the game here. I'd rather just watch that. So for me, like live tracking is not necessarily my thing. I like to go back through things generally. So I mean, it depends on the project and what you have fit. I mean, personally, I have my laptop and then I have a monitor, which helps because I have 2 screens and I can kind of balance everything. Because that's generally my setup. Like Corey has like the touch screen, like whatever works for you, I think is kind of the best way to go about it.
Yeah, tracking was kind of a thing of necessity. Australian ice rinks are not the biggest. And so there is no such thing as like an upper deck area or like a walk around area where even a table or a bench might hypothetically exist that I could hypothetically put a laptop on to hypothetically track things. And even then, like in the spaces where I could work, was like quite often like really small and cramped. Like for a while at the beginning of last season, I was tracking in the production booth. So I was just taking up the spare chair and constantly demanding that the screen in front of me that had previously been, some certain screen was like a fixed camera angle screen. I was like, hi, can I please have like the wide angle view cam on my screen, please? Just so I could see more of the ice at once. Because, we run a 2-camera setup for men's hockey, a single camera for women's. So if it's not in the angle, I'm crying. But yeah, so I started there and then I moved up to the camera platform for a while. And then depending on where we were for away games, ones I went to, sometimes there wasn't necessarily somewhere to put me in, an opposing team's arena. I don't exactly want to be, the one couple of times I did, even in like Melbourne, which is a really nice rink and like the big, like best rink in Australia kind of thing. I was sitting in the stands. They've got nice bench seating kind of thing. So that was fine. But every single time there was a goal scored, everyone stood up in front of me. And I'm just like, hello, I need to know who is on the ice. Sit back down. So I had a 2-notebook system where I had my tracker book and then I had just a grid notebook that I would like flip over the top and hold underneath. And that was what I used to track all of the lines and shifts and which players were coming in and off the ice for each team. Because then whenever a goal was scored, I could just kind of release my thumb and the rink would appear before me, which was nice and convenient, but also an excellent way to get horrible wrist cramps during the games. Like, sometimes the team physio is having to tape up the players after the game. Sometimes they're having to tape up the team stats person because she gave herself RSI. So I guess I kind of on that note, I know obviously I have like weird, slightly different difficulties to, I guess, the average person tracking hockey in North America. But what are some of the things that you guys encounter that make it a little bit harder, and how do you kind of combat that?
I think everybody is in agreement here that NHL TV is not exactly the best streaming software. Like, it's a little, we all have our grievances with it, especially this year after the All-Star break, some of the complications they added to it. But like the other thing is broadcast cams, like some broadcasts kind of skip over things. Like it, I started doing some like 90s games recently, and they skip face-offs a lot. So if you're planning on doing any classic tracking, be prepared for that. But like, it really just depends on like the streaming software you're using and kind of just the broadcast angle that you're basically kind of at the mercy of them and what they show and what they don't. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everything Corey said. I think we're kind of in like that highlight time where we can all watch highlights and we like goals and we like big saves. And I think broadcasts are reflecting that we're not always seeing everything that leads up to a play, but those are the questions that we are all trying to ask. So I spend a lot of time changing broadcasts if I want to find a different angle or see a different player. Like, God love you, player on Team X, but like, I don't want to see so-and-so sitting on the bench. I'm so happy he's getting hydrated, but may I please see the play that's happening? And yeah, I wish that, I would literally pay actual dollars for a time-based like scroll at the bottom of NHL games. That would be like nirvana.
They used to have
and my
that,
grievances there. Well, but we don't anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
you guys have clocks. Clocks are nice. I would like
true.
Clocks.
Yeah.
But they're just hidden by the NHL so-and-so at so-and-so that lasts for way too long.
I mean, I think we're kind of, at least when we're talking NHL stuff, I mean, NHL TV has its flaws, but like at the same time, like we get HD broadcasts and we can kind of switch between. Whereas like if you're looking to try to track like a junior or like Australian hockey game, you're not necessarily as blessed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So true.
Like it irks me like when, Sportsnet will like skip over like 5 to 10 seconds of a play, sometimes 30, 40, they're off showing something, but I mean, we're still kind of blessed at the same time with NHL TV.
It's true.
And what would you say is like the one tip you wish someone had told you earlier? I feel like we all have tips that we like live by, but like, what do you wish you just knew so much earlier in the process?
Get a better computer when I started, like in 2012.
Yeah, for me, I think it's really thinking through what the question is you're trying to answer and thinking through how you're going to answer that, whether it's Excel or R or something else, because that's going to affect how you record what you're tracking. And if your recording data isn't what you need, it's so hard. There's so much effort then to make that usable after you spend all that time tracking.
Yeah, I think like keeping it simple is probably, I don't necessarily know if it's like a tip or anything, or if that's just kind of, I don't know. But I think the simpler you keep it, like the higher quality the data that comes out of it, like it's gonna be like less subjective and things too. If you could really sort of define like those few things that you're trying to track, and then you could try to, answer those questions, which will bring on other questions, which you could then go through and try to track more like complex different, things.
Yeah, and on the theme of keep it simple, I know the first time I ever tried to track something was after a particularly weird North Stars game. I wasn't even like working for the team in any capacity. I only just started writing for the league. And I was like, weird game. I would pay to find out like what the PDO was in that game. Like someone just give it to me. Cause like, honestly, that has to have been the unluckiest game ever. And 2 camera angles, neither of them really showing the entire ice. The camera platform is directly over the benches. So it's almost impossible to see players like coming on and off the ice via the camera feed. Hence why I moved out of the booth and onto the camera platform itself when I decided to start tracking like player movement stuff. And I got very overwhelmed very quickly and was like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And a year later, I drew a teeny tiny rink in a book on a game I was commentating and decided I was just going to draw X's for where the shots came from. No strength states, no player numbers, nothing. Just these are where the shots are. And so I think like if you haven't done it before, particularly if you're looking at tracking live, start with something really simple because it is like a muscle. I know if I haven't tracked anything for a while, I don't usually get really long off seasons because the men's hockey and the women's hockey kind of top and tail each other here. So, maybe a month off max. But I know by the time I've had that month off, I get to track my first game and I'm like, oh Lord, what am I doing? What is happening here? What are you doing, Alyssa? So yeah, start small. And even if like, you want to track something, find the simplest version of that and work your way up to the big thing you kind of want to do. Some questions are from the feed real quick. We have a question for you, Sean. People would like to know if the Bruins paraphernalia hung behind you is there by accident. We'll just get that one out of the way.
No, I mean, I'm from Massachusetts. It's my bedroom actually is like all like Bruins themed and everything. I have like the Marchand pictures on my wall.
Other Sean will be delighted with this answer. Another one was for any tips for tracking game footage in leagues with lower camera quality or without the clock on the screen. Follow up, are there any templates or resources for tracking those games live? Does anyone else have any thoughts on leagues with bad camera quality? Or
Corey has one.
I try to kind of what? Oh, sorry.
Well, no, go ahead.
I try to like familiarize myself with like the lines and the defense pairs before the game, just so I have an idea of who is who. Because like there are some teams where it's like it's a bad broadcast and they're wearing a white jersey with yellow numbers, and it's like good luck trying to figure out who's who there. And also, if you're tracking like the same team over and over again, like try to familiarize yourself with like the skate, like their skating strides, like just how they look, how their equipment, basically anything to give yourself like a mental cue of who's who.
I feel like I have a really in-depth knowledge of every player in the the Australian Women's League's ponytail style, so that I can spot it out the back of their helmet.
Yeah, but like as far as like the clock goes, you really just kind of have to give like an estimate there, because there's not really much you can do. Like sometimes I've never actually tried this, but someone actually told me like they have like a clock on their phone or a timer on their phone and try to like get the clock time that way. I've never tried that before, but
so with the Women's League, so we broadcast remotely, so we're not in the arena, which can be great fun for making the clock run smoothly on the broadcast, because we do have a clock. We're very proud of our clock, because not every women's league has one, and not every team within those leagues have them. But we're very, very proud of the fact that all AWIHL games come with a clock and a score and a penalty clock and penalty announcements telling you who got the penalties. Like, this is cutting edge stuff as far as like broadcast graphics in women's hockey goes. And yeah, if like getting a 20-minute timer and really listening for those whistles. You are choosing to, like, I've run the clock on broadcast streams before, not so much for the women's hockey, but I've done it a bunch of times for the men's, and it's an insanely intense job trying to keep it on and then updating it if you see that you're out, because a lot of the time you'll get a shot where you happen to be able to see the clock, and it's lovely.
And I would just add real quick too, like even in the US, like even at college hockey level, there is an online play-by-play that's timestamped that you can kind of base using a play-by-play as a cue. And sometimes you don't need time. Like if you're tracking zone entries, depending on what question you're asking, and I'll share this after we're done. I did a tracking presentation for our hockey analytics night in Canada a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes it's just a spreadsheet, or it's hash marks, depending on what question you're trying to answer. So if you can't find a different question, maybe you can answer.
Yeah, like even though we have clocks in the AWIHL, having on top of the fact that I'm attempting to do the color commentary for the game and track all of the shots, I can't also record who took the shot and what time. It's too much. I have tried it. I end up, like, it already happens far too often. My poor co-commentator goes to throw for me to something, and I'm like head down in my notebook, and I'm not even going to answer, and it's just like awkward dead air because I'm like, no. But yeah, like if you don't need it, don't track it, because you're just wasting time. And any closing thoughts, I guess, if anyone is looking at getting into this?
I mean, just I don't know, like
ask for help.
Ask your question, keep it simple.
Yeah, and ask for help. People will help you, and don't it will be frustrating and it will be very hard at first, but it will get better. So stick with it.
Yeah, the other thing is to just make guidelines for yourself of what you want to track and just stick to them. Like the biggest kind of hurdle I had when I was just tracking games at first, and even when I still do them, is like, oh, I wish I did this. I wish I added that. Oh, I'm missing this here. And it's like, oh, I can probably add them, but like I also don't want to mess up like the current guidelines I have, because that's going to screw up like the other 20 some games that I tracked like from the rest of the year. So really just like make like a list of what you want tracked, why you're tracking it, and then just start from there. And after you're done with that, then go and add stuff if you want to, if you feel like doing all that again.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be back in a moment with a presentation from Mike Murphy about NWHLe and some of the more issues you'll find trying to track things in women's hockey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Murphy, and today I'm going to do a presentation on NWHL equivalency or translation factors. Back in the 2015-16 season, which was the first season of the NWHL, I started covering women's hockey, specifically the NWHL and CWHL. And as a journalist, I became dismayed pretty early on that I couldn't find a lot of data to work with. Even really simple things like power play assists and things of that nature were hard to come by. And early on, the NWHL had some quality control with their box scores. So I took it upon myself to track games manually back when there's just the 4 teams, and just do basic checking of scoring events, things like that, and building on those counting stats to include things like primary points and points by strength. And as I developed this, it became a project. It's now going on 5 years of this counting stats project. And the reason I've stayed dedicated to it is because in women's hockey, we have a really small toolbox in terms of the resources and data that are available to us publicly. It's a really finite amount of things we can use, but the good news is it's a lot more than we had 5 years ago. Over the past several years, we've had things developed like Sean Ferris started NWHL Game Score. As I mentioned before, we have counting stats. Of course, there's just the boxcar stats, your basic stats, a lot of great player comparison tools like the work that Alyssa has done. This past season, I developed a shooting metric called Steady, named after Kelly Stedman, which is shots on goal plus shots blocked by the opposition. So it's like a cousin, a less useful cousin of Corsi and Fenwick. We also have things like penalty differential. This season, I was tracking on ice 5-on-5 goal differential for the NWHL, which I hope to work with later. But as Melissa Burgess noted earlier today in her presentation, we don't have time on ice for the NWHL. We also didn't have it for the CWHL. And for the most part, it's only available for those international tournaments. So as the years have gone on now, with 5 years of this project, I asked myself a lot, what else can I do with this data? And in April 2017, Rob Volman tweeted out a tweet that put me on a collision course to where I am today doing this presentation. And Rob at Hockey Abstract, he posted rough and preliminary translation factors for women's hockey, specifically looking at the Winter Olympics and the Worlds as the elite tournaments where that's the basis for comparing all other leagues to. And this was really exciting for me because this was a great way to get a better understanding of the world of women's hockey beyond North America's borders. And at the time, my focus was my investment in the NWHL and CWHL specifically. And Rob's work got me thinking a lot about what else I could do with my data, because I mentioned I got a little more nuanced with my data, included things like even strength scoring. So I had a lot of aspirations of doing something with equivalency and translation factors. So a year later, I checked back in with Rob, and he hadn't added anything to his work. It got put on the back burner, and I took it upon myself to carry the torch and to see if I could really do something with this field of research and expand on my project. And suddenly my counting stats project became this curious translation factor and equivalency project. At first, my goal was to really get a better idea of what the college hockey landscape looks like in North America between NCAA Division I, Division III, and U Sports. And I wanted to have a much better understanding of that transition for players from collegiate hockey to post-collegiate hockey, especially players who don't fall into the elite national team where it's between Team USA and Team Canada, there's 50 roster spots. So I wanted to look at that transition for players who might not be in that conversation. And also, I was really interested in comparing and contrasting the NWHL to the CWHL. There was a lot of movement of players between those two leagues. And, of course, back then there was a lot of NWHL versus CWHL conversations like that. And ironically, why are there two leagues? And now it's the conversation of the one league that still stands isn't good enough. So those were some of my big goals 2 or 3 years ago. And I got started on this about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. And it quickly became apparent to me, as you can tell from the title of this slide, that things were not going to be easy. In May 2019, the CWHL ceased operations. It announced it was closing its doors the month before, which effectively eliminated a lot of what I had planned to work on and a lot of the data that I had been building. I still hold on to that data, but I don't have things dating back to before when I tracked. And as Melissa mentioned in her presentation earlier today, a lot of that stuff is just gone, which is really unfortunate. So I decided to move forward with the NWHL. But moving forward with the NWHL wasn't all that easy. One of the main reasons why is there is 2 instances of this exodus events, the national team players leaving the league. First in 2017-18, I encourage you to look at Alyssa's great article for the Ice Garden that examines this, the landscape and how it changed with the national team players out of the league. The graphic here is for Alexa Grushow, who in her first season was the second line center, really solid, promising young player. And then the next season, her team won the championship and she was the MVP of the league. And as anecdotal as that is, it gives you an idea of the vacuum left by those national team players and how that would impact the entire competitive landscape of the league. And then, of course, this past season, 2019-20, we had this second exodus event. The rise of the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association meant that the vast majority of those national team players and many of the elite players from North America were no longer in the NWHL. So we had, again, a different league. And it kind of, the seasons between these 2 exodus events, the majority of those national team players returned, including some new players, players like Kendall Coyne-Schofield. But it's this roller coaster in terms of the level of competition. There's also the issue right away when I was looking at all my numbers that there was just an insignificant number of U Sports alumni. And I think it's around 9 players who've played. I'll explain later my cutoffs for removing outliers and things like that for quality control, but there's just not enough. The sample size is not good enough to get an idea of what U Sports alumni can do in terms of comparing it directly to the NCAA and NCAA Division III. There's also the issue, even without these exodus events, there's a tremendous amount of roster turnover just because of the realities of playing professional women's hockey. This is a part-time thing for these players. And we see players move from team to team because of opportunities off the ice, or they move around maybe for opportunities for better ice time, especially when for many of them, this is just, it can only be part of what they do. There's also the issue of parity. Not all teams are created equally, and that parity has shifted around a lot in the 5-year history. Another big point is the short seasons. So this past season, we had our longest NWHL season to date with 24 games. Next season, we'll go to 20 games. But prior to that, we had under 20 game seasons. The average NCAA season, I believe, is last year, I think it was about 35 games, including, tournament games and interconference games. So it's a much smaller sample size that we're working with. And that made me stray from the traditional methodology established by people like Rob Volman and Gabriel Desjardins, where you look at League A and Season 1, a player, and then you look at League B and Season 2 to directly compare and contrast what they did between those 2 leagues and look at the large sample size to get an idea of equivalency between those 2 leagues. So my solution to this was to include all of a player's collegiate career and all of their professional career. So I put together my all-time stats for the NWHL specifically, and I looked at the data publicly available from sites like Elite Prospects, and also College Hockey Inc. has a great resource for Division I women's hockey that dates back to 2012, 2013. It has a great breakdown. I spend an inordinate amount of time pouring through all that. And as I was looking through all the data and researching the best ways to go about creating these translation factors, I decided I want to do some quality control And that included eliminating outliers who had less than 0.1 points per game in either the NWHL or college. This was just a way of getting the most out of what was already a limited sample size. And the reason being is the sample size was small, so I didn't want those outliers to have too much of an impact on it. I also eliminated players who played less than 12 games in the NWHL, regardless of how many seasons it was across. So, if they were cumulatively playing 12 career games in the NWHL, I included them. I settled on 12 because it was half of the most recent season. It also felt like a substantial amount of time for players to establish themselves. There's a lot of players throughout the years who have kind of filled in, played a couple games while another player was injured. We saw a lot of PTOs last year in the NWHL, things of that nature where a player might not get any, maybe just 10 shifts in a game, but they're there to, spot and spell their teammates. So these quality control measures whittled my data set down from 161 NCAA Division I players to 149. So a good substantial group. The Division III sample size did leave a lot to be desired. It eliminated 3 players, which brought me down to 21, which wasn't a lot to work with, but it still felt pretty good. And as I had mentioned before, I think it was the U Sports was down to 9, which is why, unfortunately, I had to eliminate it from my considerations. The results of these outliers, removing them and keeping them, you can see from these the graphics here. So it was reassuring to me that it looks like production in the NCAA Division I translates better to producing in the NWHL than production in Division III collegiate hockey. That makes sense. So I was very relieved to see that. It was also really interesting to me that removing the outliers didn't have a really significant impact on what these translation factors came out to be, which is why I wanted to include both, just to provide as much of a sample size. Maybe the application of this is to have something of a range, but of course, equivalency is projecting and analyzing. It's far from an exact science. We can't just apply a translation factor and say, this rookie, Sammy Davis will have this many points with the Boston Pride because she had this many points playing in her collegiate career. With all that being said, all the issues that I had mentioned before and many of the issues that have already been discussed today by other presenters, it became clear to me that these were at best these cardinal directions. I knew that there was work to do here still, but the cardinal directions could still be pretty valuable. With that being said, I did want to know what these looked like if I approached with that traditional methodology. So looking back to the past 2 seasons specifically, I looked at the rookie classes and I had some quality control measures, players who were under 24 years of age in their first NWHL season. In some cases, a player like Mallory Soliotis of the Pride, I think played 1 or 2 games in her first rookie season. And then, her next season, was she technically a rookie by the strictest definition? Well, it depends on who your definition comes from, but I just combined it in those cases where a player had a little cup of coffee playing in the NWHL after they were drafted or signed. And this study, using this traditional methodology of what they did in the league 1 year, in NCAA hockey 1 year, to what they did at the pro level the next year, really revealed a lot about those problems with the shifting landscape of the NWHL to me. So in year 4, which was the 2018-19 season, you can see that the Division I seniors as rookies, their production slipped down, which makes sense because of what you would expect it to be more difficult to produce at the NWHL level. Very interestingly, this past season, the rookie class actually produced more than what they did in the NCAA, which is obviously really intriguing and something I intend to dig into more. But there are some factors worth noting there why we may have come out to that result, including we had a lot of rookies who had really high shooting percentages. We also had the longer season, which could also be an influence. But it's it's really interesting to me that we have that, that stark contrast of, the disparity between what they did and their senior season in college and what they did in their NWHL season changed so dramatically just between 2 years, which makes me feel better about my first methodology, the looking at their entire collegiate career and measuring it against their entire NWHL career. And it also revealed to me that despite all of my work and manually mining data and trying to get the best translation factors possible and coming up with something I can really feel good about, making it as bulletproof as possible, it was an anticlimax for me. I felt like it didn't get to where I wanted it to be. It left a lot wanting, but I recognize this as progress for what I'm going to do next, what I hope others will also continue to do. And the next steps is what excites me right now. So the good news is we're scheduled to have another season of NWHL hockey, and more hockey means more data. And as I mentioned before, the next season is 20 teams. There's also the expansion into Toronto. But I also know I can refine even the methodology I presented today. I can implement things like even strength scoring, which has been shown to give us more accurate translation factors in men's hockey. I can take measures to segregate forwards from defenders, although that may be pretty tricky because there's a lot of instances, it's much more frequent in women's hockey at both the collegiate and professional level for players to play both positions. And you get into the debate of, well, if they only played one game at D or one game at forward, as opposed, like what's the cutoff for designating them as a swing player or a slash player or a rover, whatever term you want to use. I plan to develop game score for the NCAA. That's my ongoing project now in the off season, and using game score as a way to get a better idea of what that transition looks like from collegiate hockey to the pro game. Another encouraging thing, although we haven't seen it play out yet in NWHL free agency, is the Toronto expansion might mean we get more U Sports alumni, which would hopefully expand that sample size of 9 to something a little more significant, some numbers we can work with. There's also a lot of work to be done with the NCAA data, especially Division III and U Sports, which as far as I'm aware, we just don't, the data that's publicly available isn't very robust. For instance, with the Division I data, we have things publicly available like primary points. We also just have even strength scoring, although it doesn't break down even strength primary points and things of that nature. But there's a lot there where we can grow on. And I feel like there's a lot of work that we can do in women's collegiate hockey in North America because there are resources available. And we do have a lot of young people interested and involved in women's college hockey. It feels like a very fertile ground to grow women's hockey analytics. I also think it would be interesting to implement factors like strength of conferences, because not all conferences are created equal, especially in NCAA Division I. It's the next horizon to me. What I might do in addition to or after developing some game score stuff for NCAA Division I is Europe. And the reason I want to look to Europe is the Swedish Hockey League, the SDHL in particular. Right now, it has many of the best players in the world. The Swedish and Finnish national teams, those players who are not playing collegiate hockey in North America, play here for the most part. There's also a lot of players who have come through those programs. There's also, as we go on, more and more overlap with the North American League. So we have players moving around back and forth, or just one way or the other, between the CWHL and NWHL to Europe into leagues like the EWHL and the Swedish Hockey League, as well as recently the Russian Hockey League, the Zhenskaya Hockey League. What makes the Russian League interesting is it has a little bit of estimated time on ice data, which is great, but it has a lot less overlap with the North American leagues, very little overlap with collegiate hockey in terms of players who played in either the NCAA Division I or II or U Sports. So I have a good idea of where I want to go next with this project. And, Micah earlier today said, the reward for doing something is you get to do it again. And that's really what I came away with while I was working on this. Is this felt like a good start, and those cardinal directions I feel like I've established are a great heading to take. And they told me a lot about where I should go and where I should potentially encourage others to go with this. But it's something, right? We're getting closer to developing another tool here. And even in this still, I'm not sure if I would call it rough and preliminary, maybe rough. So that's what I'll call these, as rough translation factors for now. And we can test how useful they are this in the upcoming NWHL season. And hopefully, like I said before, the more hockey we have, the more data we have to work with. I just wanted to take a moment here at the end to thank Alyssa for everything. She's a champion of women's hockey. She's pretty much, to me, is Australian ice hockey. I'm not sure it would even be on my radar without her, but she's always so helpful with sounding ideas off of. Shayna, who bullied me into doing this. She's a terrible person. Michelle, Eleni, Meredith, all the people at the Ice Garden who have to put up with all my grief and asking questions and me showing them things that they may or may not be interested in. Tom and Joe at Blue Shirt Banner, the ever helpful Hockey Graphs crew. I'm a lurker and I just ask questions, and they're all so helpful. Carl at the NWHL, as many of you may know, I worked for the NWHL this past season, and Carl and I worked really hard to get all the stats as accurate as they can be, and I bothered him a lot, and he was always a good sport about it. Anyone who has used my data or shared my work, whether or not it included analytics, thank you so much. And of course, the women's hockey stats community, everyone who takes a little bit of time to grow this, to move it a little further along. Today on Twitter, someone asked me, how can I get involved? And women's hockey is this largely unspoiled wilderness, this frontier, where any little innovation, any little measure you take, even if you just track one game and tweet about it, it makes a difference. It gives us a little bit more, because really we just don't have that much. But I think that's it. Thank you all so much for listening. And that's about it.
Say there's one question from Spencer in the chat, and despite the fact we don't have time, it will be my birthday gift to him is asking it. How much of the increased translation factor can be attributed to Christina
Coutinho
and Lexi Lang's absurd seasons as part of the Pride?
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point Spencer brings up. A lot of really, really productive rookies were on the Pride. I think their entire second forward line was rookies. It was Tori Sullivan, Christina Coutinho. Oh, no, Coutinho was on the first line. It was Lexi Lang, Carly Taves, and Tori Sullivan. And they all were really productive. And then, of course, there is Kendall Cornine and the Riveters, who just piled up points. And last year, the thing is, there's all these little factors, right? It's really hard to assign a weight to these things. How much did this impact it? How much did that? But I would say it was definitely an influence that the Pride had so many players who, prior to the season, we had, I think, just a handful of players who scored 25 points or more this season. I think this year we had, if it wasn't a dozen, it might have been 10. I don't know. I'm probably way off, and I'll feel like a goofball when I look at this later. But it definitely had an impact, those productive rookies. And the question keeps me up at night when I'm looking at this data is, would they have been productive the year before when we have national team players? I don't know.
Okay, well, thank you for coming on and presenting. Obviously, I absolutely adore all of the work you do. I've squished you in. I missed a nap. There was 10 minutes I could have napped there at some point. But it's been great to have you on, and we'll be seeing Mike again in not long at all for the women's hockey panel. But now a momentary break before we go to Shayna. Oh, are we cutting? There we go.
Hi. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shayna. I am 1/3 of the Too Many Men podcast, and I write for Hockey Graphs and The Athletic. I'm talking about something that I write about a lot, which are contracts. It's something that we all analyze and talk about, so I wanted to talk about my approach in the hopes that I can improve our overall process, or at least improve how we talk shit about contracts, because all of us have opinions on them. So I'm going to break down ways with publicly available resources and context, talking about extensions, signings, UFAs, and RFAs. So first, there's a couple signing considerations that we should go through off the bat. And the first is whether there are available contract projections. This is important both before and after a signing actually does take place. Matt Cain, who's now of the New Jersey Devils, created a contract model that could help guide our analysis. And the Evolving Wild Twins now have that. Luke and Josh. It's available for subscribers on evolvinghockey.com. And if not, we don't have the projections. What alternative options are there? We also have to talk about the long-term outlook of this deal. Does it make sense now and in the future? And that counts for both short and long-term contracts. Does this make sense for the signing team in their current position? Does it make sense for a rebuilding team to sign the biggest fish in free agency, or does it make sense for a contending team to spend a lot on a bottom six player? And are there aging concerns to keep in mind? So we're going to start with Evolving Hockey's projections. They're very interactive on their website. You can play around with the signing period and the salary cap. That's super important right now because the salary cap most of us have been working with probably is not what the salary cap is going to be next year based on what everything is going on in the world. It shows the probability of the term for every contract, and then it has a value for each term length. So to use their data, it helps to have a basic understanding of how their data and model works. It's two models working in tandem, one for the term and one for the cap hit percentage. They go with the cap hit percentage, so it's more easily adjustable for the changing salary cap. And the model it's weighted to account for the player's last 3 years in the NHL. And their factors include position, age tier, contract status, all situation, time on ice, shooting hand, and underlying numbers that include game score, individual Corsi, and individual expected goals, among others. You can read more about this on the glossary of their website. And something also important is what's not included. The player's previous contract value and whether or not they were bought out are not included in this. So that's important when you look at a player like Kevin Shattenkirk. His contract value might seem higher than it should be because it's not accounting for the fact that he's still making money off of his buyout. So with their projections, I like to take them and plug them into CapFriendly's comparable tool. I create a custom comparable, putting in the player's information plus the cap hit and term from evolvinghockey.com. So here's an example of that with Matthew Barzal, who's one of the leading pending restricted free agents. Their model gives a 48% chance of an 8-year term, which carries a $9.6 million cap hit. And we can use this tool with that information, or even the average term and average cap, which is included on evolvinghockey.com as well. So in analysis, you can use a screen cap from Cap Friendly like this if you wanted to, but it's a lot of information. So it might help you to just take what's pertinent from it so you don't overwhelm your viewer or reader. It's better to focus on what's important instead of just displaying everything. And quickly with this one, you can see the age checks out. He's, a young 23-year-old player. An 8-year deal really isn't a concern. The long-term outlook, good too. But then you have to question, does it work for the Islanders now? And is this something that their general manager would do? So with restricted free agents, with all free agents, but more specifically with restricted free agents, there's a couple other considerations to talk about as well. Trends are very important. You can see, it's a copycat league. Last year's trends were that restricted free agents were pushing for shorter term deals, which would help them maximize their earnings in the future if they played better, or if the cap went up because of the new TV deal or incoming Seattle team. But on the other hand, it seemed like general managers were finally recognizing to sign players to these massive contracts sooner to pay for their present and future performance instead of their past performance. So the player's long-term trajectory, like I mentioned before. So the team's cap situation is something else to consider. You can look at the Tampa Bay Lightning right now. They have Anthony Cirelli and Mikhail Sergachev as restricted free agents, and it would make sense to sign them now and maximize what you could to handle, the cap for years to come. But they don't have the money to do it. Even if they clear cap space, it seems pretty impossible. So you have to remember that, they probably can't handle that, which is why they might lean towards a shorter term contract, similar to what Point signed with the 3-year deal versus going for the full 7-year deal or 8-year deal. The general manager's tendencies also play into this. We can go back to Tampa, and while it was Steve Yzerman and is now Julian Brisbois, they did work together. So the tendencies may remain. For many of their players, they signed them first to a shorter term bridge deal before going for the long term contract. So keeping that in mind might help guide your analysis as well. Also, buying into RFA years. So you can look at Winnipeg last year, and it might have been one of the best teams that they could afford to put together because you had lesser contracts for players like Connor Hellenbuck, Jacob Trouba, Patrick Laine, and Kyle Connor. So with the rising costs, they can't afford to supplement their talent around the entry-level deals and lower cost restricted free agent deals either. So that's going to hurt their window of contention too. Also, what number contract is it for the player? Did they already get a bridge deal? Is this their 3rd or 4th contract? Like, these things do come into play. So you could look at Ryan Pulock and say he's on his bridge deal already. Maybe now it looks like he'll get that long-term deal, where before it was only his 2nd contract where they felt more comfortable going with the bridge deal. So along with the evolving hockey projections, you can also look at Dom Luszczyszyn's work. He has valuations. These are valuations based on their market value. It's what they should be paid based on their projected value. They are not actual projections. It accounts for how the players will likely age and is adjusted for inflation. And he created his stat, game score value added cost per win, for all forwards and defensemen. And if you look back on an article he wrote at The Athletic last July, it shows you the cost per win for both forwards and defensemen. So right here we have Artemi Panarin, who was the big fish of last offseason, and he was worth 3.4 wins at the time of his signing and 2.9 on average through the life of his contract. So it shows you that he's worth the money. But what this graphic also shows you is how his game is expected to decline, though stay as a top level player, but decline as the contract goes on, which brings us to aging. So aging curves are imperative to keep in mind with every single contract and every signing. You can go to Hockey Graphs to read what Evolving Wild did using wins above replacement. Cam Lawrence has done work over at Canucks Army, and he also has something on Hockey Graphs about how physical players age. Eric Tolsky has done work at SB Nation and Broad Street Hockey before moving on to work with the Carolina Hurricanes. His work included goalie survivorship, talking about which types of forwards age more gracefully, how scoring rates change as a player ages. And of course, you have to talk about exceptions. So the general rule is good to stick by. If you look at a player like Anders Lee, you expect that a net front player is going to decline more rapidly than others, or at least adhere to the curve because they take more wear and tear. You can see that with players like Jamie Benn right now. But on the other hand, if you're looking back at the example of Panarin, he may not age according to the curve because he, before signing his contract, had just 4 years of NHL experience to his name. The first was the only one where you actually saw him hitting and taking hits. And since then, he avoids as much contact as possible, which could extend his NHL career as well. So using Dom's evaluation, you can put that into cap friendly, and this helps if you don't have a projection from Evolving Hockey yet. And you can put this in just to see similar players. Normally, I would parse out the positions to try to stick with, all wingers and all centers because they are usually judged differently and assessed differently. But with this, there's fewer players in that top tier. So this is just top tier players put together. What's also important to note here is the citations. It's so important to note where you got your data from. And here it's Dom and Cap Friendly. They all do really incredible work. So you want to make sure that you cite exactly where you're getting it from. So you can also take Evolving Hockey's projection for Panarin and put it into compare and see where their models differ, because it never hurts to have, something else as a gut check. And for here, it just shows that Jonathan Taves was had a higher match percentage than what he did with using Dom's valuation. So what if there aren't projections available? And this might happen more often with a mid-season signing. So you have to create your own comparable, which is something I tried to do with the Chris Kreider signing to estimate what his contract could look at. And my starting point was using comparable deals. So you can look at the players' scoring rates to find, similar players at the same production levels. We know this is something, many traditionalists in hockey rely on points and their production rates. Role is also important. What are other top 6 wingers making, or top line left wings making? Player type. So who else is that net front presence or power forward? What are they making? What are their contracts looking like? And the other question is current market. So for Kreider, I looked at players including Max Pacioretty signing in Vegas, Jordan Eberle signing with the Islanders, and the best player for each of these categories was Anders Lee. They have the most similar playing style, most similar production size, and the market was right there since he signed the offseason previous. So I used him as my jumping off point just to find contracts that were similar to Lee, and that would also make sense for Kreider to start my analysis. So along with just talking about the contract as a whole, it's important to break down the contracts as well. Here, we're sticking with Artemi Panarin since he was the biggest contract of last season, and his really does fit perfectly. So along with front and back loading deals, teams with deeper pockets can add more lucrative signing bonuses to sway players that can make a contract more buyout proof. And it also can guarantee more payment even in lockout years, since they would get their signing bonus on July 1st when the lockout would be announced later. So with Panarin, you can see that his base salary is only $1 million every year. His signing bonuses is the bulk of his earnings, and his total salary and average cap hit stay the same despite, this structure. But this is what gave the Rangers the edge in signing him when there were comparable deals, and even some with more money, because they offered it in this way. Another thing to keep in mind are clauses. Here it's the full no movement clause, but it can help keep it in check too, because it's a leverage that teams might use to change the cap hit that they would have paid. So with contracts, especially free agent signings, we hear a lot about taxes. So taxes are secondary, but they're still a consideration. We really don't hear about it in hockey nearly as much as we do other sports. I think it was Kristen Yelich. He was in Florida and wanted to remain in a no income tax state and had that in his contract. We'll hear about it with the Super Bowl too, with players playing on the road. But with the NHL, we still have to consider it because there's federal, state, provincial, and city taxes to consider. NHLers are in the top tier no matter what. If they have minimum salaries, they still fit into the top tier for all states. Where they reside also plays into it. So a player in New York might choose not to live in the city. They just save themselves from the New York City tax if they live on Long Island or in Connecticut. Same with Washington, D.C. if they live in Virginia or Maryland. What also has to be kept in mind, though, is for as much as they're trying to save at home, they're still going to face taxes on the road. So there's city and state jock taxes to consider, and most levy them if they have them. The only team that's a little bit quirky here is Illinois. They only tax visiting players if the Blackhawks are taxed well in their state. There's also a tax treaty in the U.S. and Canada for those who live in both countries, and not all states follow that, so that's another consideration. But it is important to note because players are taxed differently on their signing bonuses versus salary. So in Canada, signing bonuses are considered the total income, so it changes how they're taxed. So here we're going back to Panarin again. These were the leading contenders for him, and it shows how his net income would be different depending on where he would play. Again, it's not the end all be all, but it is a consideration. And we can see how the differences are between playing in a no income state tax like Florida versus New York. This is a tool on Cap Friendly that is available for everyone. It is not exact, but it does give you a good estimate. So we also have to look at evaluations afterwards, how we would evaluate players. So general managers don't have the benefit of hindsight when signing players. So we don't have the benefit of hindsight when evaluating them afterwards. We also can't fault a player for taking a beneficial contract. Any player would take it. It's on the general manager for offering it. So I think there's always like a tough balance there. And it's still a business, so we do have to consider this when talking about costs relative to player movement. So one way we can do this is with Dom Lucian's stat, expected wins. It ties game score value added to salary value, and it gives you the answer of whether a player is contributing more value than their salary would dictate. So you can do this on a player team level, like Allison Lucan did for the Athletic, for the Columbus Blue Jackets, or on a league level, which Dom did for the Athletic, to look at the best and worst contracts in the league. So one other thing we can look at is general manager efficiency. Peter Flynn presented at the Rochester Hockey Analytics Conference presenting this. It uses Evolving Hockey's wins above replacement data. He created stats including efficiency, anticipated goals above replacement, which is what the player is expected, what level and value they're supposed to have based on their cap hit, and excess goals above replacement. So if they provided more value than what they were expected to based on their cap hit. So this is less for looking at players and judging them, but more for general managers, I would say. It can help you determine whether or not they get the best out of their restricted free agents. Do they make good choices with unrestricted free agents? Do they make the most out of entry-level contract years? So you can use this to help anticipate what they do and how they're going to do it, or if there's room for improvement as well. So there are a number of tools out there to help you analyze contracts, and there's a lot of context to consider. The key is figuring out how to best balance it. I want to thank Allison and Mike for being my sounding boards, Alyssa for putting on such a great conference, and the Evolving Wild Twins, Luke and Josh, for their projections, along with Dom and Peter for their data. MetaHockey is a super handy resource to look up anything you want to know about contracts that they have on there, or aging curves, which is where I got most of my information, and Cap Friendly, which is one of the best tools around there for anything revolving salary information. And here's where you can find me.
Okay, thank you for that. I think the chat is minorly overwhelmed at the amount of international financial law they just ingested. Either that or the stream is running late again. I'm just not getting questions through. But I am seeing we are back on time track again, so I am conveniently not waiting to see if anyone establishes a question. If you have them, direct them to Shayna on Twitter. I have a 20-minute food break I'm trying to get to at some point in time. I want breakfast. So we'll be back in just a moment with a women's hockey roundtable. So stay tuned for that. Okay, hello and welcome to the Women's Hockey Analytics panel. I have assembled the dream team, and I would like everyone to acknowledge that. Before we begin, how about we all go around and just introduce yourself and maybe a little bit about how you got started in women's hockey analytics as against, I guess, men's hockey analytics, which is the considerably easier route, I think we can all agree.
I guess I'll go first. I'm Carly. I am currently a college student in physics and stats. That's my full-time job right now. So, but I first got into hockey analytics, I think like 4 years ago. And I was originally really into the Sharks because they're my home team. But when I got into the analytics community, it was really hard to break into men's hockey analytics because so many of people have already done so many things. It's been around for 10 years plus. So starting from a beginning point and at that point there wasn't the infrastructure we have today where, bossing people at hockey graphs and evolving hockey and stuff like that. It'd be here's what we did. Here is steps A, B, and C, and these lovely articles written out of how to do stuff. Or even, how to track stuff and how to get started on your own. So I was out here kind of just I don't know what to do. Then I figured out the NWHLe was a thing. And I was nobody's doing stats for this. This seems cool. I can track stuff. These are numbers. I can do stuff with them. And at that point, I was really into visualizations. So cracked out Tableau and started making graphs, and everyone liked them. So I took off from there. And now here we are.
Awesome. Would you like me to go next, I guess? Megan Chaika from Stathletes. We were doing hockey analytics or tracking data about 12, 13 years ago, incorporated 10 years ago. And just being a woman in sports in general, I always saw a huge gap of supporting women athletes. And I think part of my thesis is that without women leadership, you don't really see the gaps. A lot of males don't even think about, women's hockey on their radar as not only good for women, but promoting the sport in general, getting more people engaged, getting young people seeing that both men and women can be professional athletes and can perform at a high level. So I think we did our first CWHL game maybe 6-7 years ago. And it's always been a push for my staff and me as well to do more. We even have one of our best managers, executives, had her stick in the Hockey Hall of Fame. She played Division 3 Tier 3 Division 3 hockey and scored the winning goal. So we've always tried to support in any way, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you on your perspective.
I guess that leaves my turn. I just did a presentation where I mentioned I really got involved back in 2015-16. Prior to that, I was a fan of women's hockey first. I paid attention to the Olympics, but wasn't, where I live in New Jersey, I'm not near any of the, college hockey programs. So I got involved because I was already writing about hockey, men's hockey, and the New York Rangers specifically. And then this opportunity arose with the NWHL moving into my backyard. And I wanted to get involved, and there was a need for data. And I wanted to put it together, and I made it a public resource. And that's kind of been a collision course. It wasn't my plan to spend hundreds of hours of my life manually mining data, but that's what's happened. It's just something I started and hasn't stopped since.
I guess for me,
did any of us really plan on getting into women's hockey with this data desert we have? No.
I didn't plan on getting into hockey. I'm still not sure how that happened, to be honest.
Okay.
But yeah, for me at least, kind of follows on from what I was talking about in the manual tracking thing. I kind of started liking hockey, got involved in the Australian ice hockey scene, and was writing for the league in Australia when the Ice Garden kind of popped up. And I was like, wow, there's, you know, a whole hockey season where I'm not doing anything, because our men's season runs like this time of year usually. And I was like, wow, I could be doing stuff in there. Got into women's hockey and realized they had the exact same problems as Australian men's hockey and just not having any information. I was like, well, I guess I do this here now as well. And then as far as like being involved with like doing all the stats tracking for the Australian Women's League, I was just doing it because I was commentating men's leagues games here. And next thing I know, I'm commentating full seasons of women's leagues games. And I'm like, oh, buddy, everyone, we are about to introduce you to advanced stats. They will be in the broadcast. They will not be optional. So yeah, that was just kind of how it happened for me. And I probably think the next thing is just kind of, we've talked a little bit about the landscape. But Megan, I know you probably do more work in international hockey than the rest of it. How have you seen, I guess, the buy-in from international teams? Like, they're the ones in women's hockey that actually have, I guess, a bank balance as against the rest of the leagues. So how are you seeing that like translate as analytics becomes a bigger thing just in hockey in general?
For sure. And I think that's always a struggle, right, is capital and resources. And sometimes just not throwing more bodies at a problem of, you know, data collection and cleaning works either. You have to have a lot of sophistication to, you know, have data sets that you then can translate and have fans be able to see them and, you know, reach more people. So for me, I went to like the high impact spots. So obviously the Olympics, all national team programs, especially Canada and US, they just want to win one game every 4 years. That's what matters, right? So you're trying to align like other people, and in a lot of ways, a lot of them are run by men at the top too. They're the ones that are making decisions for, you know, women's hockey teams. So you have to align with their objectives, with your objectives of doing more women's hockey. And I've been a bit sneaky. You know, the last Olympics I went and I was like, the men are, you know, 38 with like 2 hip replacements. Like, let's focus on the women, you know? And they were like, oh, that's a good idea. And then I went to the lead executive and he's like, yeah, we'll do the women's. And he's like, but what about the men? And I was like, you are the first person to ever say, but what about the men? Like, that's amazing. I was like, I guess I'll do the men too.
That non-ironically.
Yes, it was actually a concern that the men were getting passed over and the women had better data. So needless to say, you know, there's ways to have the women supported through other means and through, you know, coordination with other men programs too. So that's how I've attacked, you know, doing more scale in international hockey. And it also hits a lot of the national teams. The women I'm most worried about are the ones that, you know, slide into those gaps where there's kind of dead space. You know, they maybe haven't quite made the national team, but you don't know who's doing well or what that looks like beyond a scout, but even they can't go to that many games or watch that much game tape. So I think that's like the area that, you know, I'd love to see improved and work with like the people on this call to figure out how.
No, I think on that note, there's like I think one of the best examples of the big, I guess, data gap. It's like a lot of the time we can like assess men's or like a wide range of men's hockey players, but you know, you go find yourself a nice table and you sort. And you know, it's not the best form of analysis, but it'll give you like a basic idea of, you know, who should I be looking in depth with a little more. And I think sometimes that's missing a little bit in women's hockey. And I think the big one that was obvious with that, for me at least, was the entire Melody Daly situation. Like on the 2014 Olympic team, played well by all accounts, comes back to youth sports. I think she broke a leg, I'm pretty sure, or like something. There was a leg bone involved. Missed like the world championship and like 4 nations that year, obviously because she's injured. And then it was like Hockey Canada just forgot she existed for multiple years. And, you know, youth sports isn't the most covered leagues or scouted or tracked or anything really. But I just happened to be covering youth sports at the time. And I was like, she's so good. Why do they keep not picking her? And, you know, the first event she was picked up for was, I think it was the 4 nations immediately prior to the Olympics. And then the Olympics, and she got, you know, MVP of the entire tournament. It's just like, you know, if we had that kind of breadth of data across, you know, even if it's just NCAA and youth sports, like how many like potentially phenomenal players are slipping through the cracks because, you know, they're not on a national team, so we don't know their name.
Someone I comes to mind when you talk about Medley Daoud is Blake Bolden. She was in the NWHL for a really long time, and honestly, I thought she was going to get picked for the national team for years, but it never happened for whatever reason. But I think that's the same kind of situation where like they get passed over because they don't have those kind of connections to the national team already through NCAA or anything like that. And it's definitely a gap that needs to be filled because, we're missing out on like these great players that, could elevate this sport like by miles. And because we don't have the data to back it up. And like Megan was saying, you can only send a couple of scouts to a couple of games. There's only so many bodies you can put at a rink that, you're, like I said, we're missing out on those people.
I think Jacka's hand is just in the chat telling me that it was the 14-15 season and it was her knee. And then she was averaging about 2 points per game at the U Sports level, which I was covering her for a decent amount of that
Seems
time.
good.
It was phenomenal to watch. And it's really weird because like her goal in the gold medal game, like obviously everyone knows the gold medal goal kind of thing, but like the Melody Daoud goal is like the best goal of that game. And I will stand by that.
It was, yeah.
And
it was a nice goal.
Close to not happening. Like it kind of stuck with their core that they'd been, playing all the way up to the Olympics and not brought her back in. Like, does that, like, we don't have that. So it's just, how, kind of people going to, is it going to expand into college hockey? I guess that's probably the next thing. Like, obviously, professional leagues, professional women's hockey players association, then you got the NWHL and, your European leagues. Now, they're all kind of like working it out slowly, but until like, I think the leagues or organizations themselves are like, we want to do advanced stats. Like there's very little you can do. Like we saw that this past year when the NWHL updated their website and just locked all the tracking data that's on their website in a vault and stopped tracking shot locations. It's like, I understand why you did it, but like, it was just like very clear that like, this isn't a priority to them. And that's fair. Like they're trying to pay the players and make sure they have decent healthcare and, that they can do this professionally. I get, analytics is a fair way down the list in terms of things they want. But like moving forward, I think like NCAA and U Sports, there's definitely a lot of teams taking strides. And I guess just what do you guys think in terms of that as kind of the next frontier where we can see women's hockey analytics kind of grow?
That's what I look forward to. I think, we mentioned some of those blind spots and how players slip through the cracks. And if you think of what's publicly available, for scouts and, for fans and writers, just to get a better idea of what the talent landscape is like, there's really just not enough out there for Division III and, even for like, the ACHA and of course U Sports. And there's a lot more available for Division I, which is great because of sites like College Hockey Inc. But I feel like there hasn't been enough work done. I know anecdotally, a lot of programs have, a lot of time it's volunteer work, volunteer students who dig into analytics and help the coaching staff implement them. But it's the point Megan brought up because it's this wide-ranging issue of capital and resources. And like you said, Alyssa, how far down the list?
Unionize the students, the ones that are tracking.
Yeah.
Unionize the tracking.
That's what we need to do. Yeah. We need to, I think that it's like, it's funny to say that, but if there's a way to kind of motivate, these people who care about hockey, especially young people, and they're in universities, they're in school right now, and there's this opportunity. Like I say this all the time to people, any innovation you can make, if you can only track one game, if you've never tracked a game before, any little contribution you make will make an impact, because this is just like this largely untouched frontier. As I'm sure all of us have experienced, you start wading into the waters here and you're like, oh, none of this exists. This is like Carly called it, like, this desert or this barren wasteland. And that's often how it feels. So even if you can contribute just a little bit, it makes such a big impact. And I think the NCAA is so fascinating to me because, as I mentioned in my presentation today, I think it's this last season, Division I, the average season was like 35 games, with tournaments and everything and interconference games. So you have a significant season. You have, there are resources there. There are a lot of the things you need in place. Whereas, for example, the NWHL, their priority, as you said, Alyssa, is, paying players and, putting jerseys on players, things like that. And, how far down the list analytics go. I know from experience, from talking to, the commissioner, Danny Ryland, when I worked there this past season, that they care about stats. They want stats. The problem is just...
Similar question, just cutting you off a second to the same vein. A question comes from the chat being like, do you think women's hockey is more open to analytics innovations?
I have two thoughts about that. So I think women's hockey has a lot more room for potential, I guess, because like I was saying earlier, men's hockey, a lot of tracks have been tread already. And when you're getting into men's hockey analytics, it's very easy to see what people have done already and build off of that, right? So it maybe not like, you're not instituting like revolutionary ideas or developing new ways to look at the game. Whereas in women's hockey, like because we don't have that infrastructure that exists already, there's so much more room to grow, and you have to think creatively about how to evaluate players, how to evaluate teams, because you can't take stats from the men's side and transfer them over to the women's side because the underlying numbers just aren't there. So I think in terms of that, innovations there's more potential for innovations, but also because we don't have the same kind of data, I think that also is like kneecaps us. Because we don't.
Interesting, I guess, front on that, which I guess like kind of links to something Megan said earlier with, you have someone who works with you who, was a Div 3 college hockey player. I think because women's hockey players on average are just more educated because they kind of have to do those 4 years of college. Like that's the only option. So, your average women's hockey player, at least a bachelor's degree, like minimum kind of thing.
A lot of them have Ivy League degrees, right?
Yeah.
They're like,
a ton of them do.
Yeah.
They do a master's because you can go somewhere else.
They play post-collegiate hockey while they're getting their master's and
But I think that also opens up a lot of opportunities. Well, the potential for a lot of opportunities. I think it's something that is being underutilized a little bit. I know I've talked to one of the goaltenders here in the Australian League, Sarah Spinomal. She's the goaltending coordinator for the entire Australian program. But she also has a PhD in sports science. And we keep talking, we're like, we have to do something on goalies eventually. And just like, that's something we don't necessarily get an opportunity to do, I guess. Occasionally you get like a men's hockey player who, does their career, comes out the other side and it's like, wow, I want to look at the analytics side of this. But you're not getting the ones that, have done all of these years of knowing how to research things, like Sarah's miles smarter than I'll ever be kind of thing. And just the ability, like the potential for us to potentially collaborate with players to work out better ways to assess the game. Like there's always there is that, I guess, historical disconnect between analytics and the players. And, I know I say it all the time, the players don't need to know the numbers kind of thing. Like the coach needs to know the numbers, but that they can work out how to tell it to the players. The players don't need to know, what their Corsi is or, how exactly they were doing in this fancy stat. But I think women's hockey and just the level of education that these players have could potentially open up some really exciting opportunities to collaborate directly with the players themselves and work out how to kind of quantify things better. I don't know. What are everyone else's thoughts?
Well, I know from experience, I think everyone knew that it wasn't exactly my job title at the NWHL, but everyone knew I was going to be involved in the stats, and largely that just involved me bothering Carl, who was responsible for the stats, and sending a lot of emails at 2 a.m. saying, we got to fix this secondary assist, or this player needs to have at least 5 block shots in this game. They don't have any. Things like that. I don't even know how many emails I sent him. But I know anecdotally, like I got a lot of DMs throughout the season from players who were like, just so you know, I was credited for an assist here. I didn't have an assist there. And players also a lot more instances of I deserve a secondary assist, make sure I get it. So they know the numbers, they care. Like it's the classic hockey player trope, right? They know the stats. It just, especially in men's hockey, they may not exactly be open to the stats when they don't help tell the story of they deserve a bigger contract. But this is a common trend, especially with this, even collegiate hockey, but specifically I think post-collegiate hockey, and those players who might not fall into national team, the lucky few, it's this game of musical chairs for them. They all care so much about hockey. They're so invested in it. They sacrifice at times a more stable career path just to keep playing. Like I know in the NWHL last year, we had players flying in from North Carolina to play games in, Monmouth Junction, New Jersey. And they couldn't practice with their team, but they wanted to play. They care. And I think that's something to take away here is we have this community that we can activate, both players and fans and members of the media, where we can do more and get more out of this. It's just a question of motivating people. And like you said, Alyssa, unionizing a bunch of students, putting together an Avengers team, making people care a little bit more. And I think for the past couple of years, I've been trying to figure out how we do that. And, I see little, here and there, these little flowers, bloom in the desert of people who start tweeting about analytics in the women's hockey community, members of the media who start implementing them, even if it's just counting stats. And I'm like, this is progress. We're working in the right direction, but man, is it ever slow. It doesn't go as fast as I need it to.
And yeah, we actually work with some national team members like one-on-one, and it's great. And I feel like women are more open to it, maybe as you alluded to, whether it's education or just they realize they need more resources that they're not finding internally. So we've done obviously a lot of work with like the very elite men's hockey in the NHL in terms of player and agent side. So using that as sort of a template to spring off on, helping women's hockey players in development, what that means in their sprint to the Olympics or the World Championship, and really engaging with what resonates with them and what's important, and knowing it's not the same as the men's game, but there are a lot of comparables in terms of how it's played. And I actually sit on a board for one of the states for women in sports to engage from like the state level. And it's interesting to hear them talk about like football or soccer, all these other big sports as drivers. And they actually said, oh, and hockey is pretty similar, men and women. So we should see more crossover as like more women become executives or, engaged both ways, right? Men and women. And I think that's something that we don't utilize as much. And there's like a lot of male dominated companies that are like, they're going to step in and they're going to help and save women's hockey or save women executives. And we don't need to be saved. Like you said, we have the education, we have everything. We just have to figure out sustainable business models.
And I guess I have one more bit before we kind of wrap up. I think it's something we deal with in women's hockey, I guess, a lot. Men's hockey to a level too, but I think in women's hockey particularly because it is such kind of a small group of people that kind of engage with analytics. How do we juggle like public versus private work? Like obviously I'll direct it to you, Megan, in a second. But like I know for me, like the AWIHL, I try to make all of the data I do public. And if I don't, like if it doesn't go public because I don't have a complete data set or whatever, like it doesn't go anywhere. And, but occasionally I'll have like coaches reach out to me being like, hey, can I have this? And just trying to work out like how much, and particularly for me, like I'm not getting paid for any of it, like how much am I willing to give away and like potentially like give teams an advantage for free versus like how much do I want that to just be like public information that then people can go and do with it what they want. I guess for you, how do you juggle it? Because obviously Stathletes is like a private entity that like gets contracted and stuff like that.
Right. And when you have big clients too, obviously you're very protective of who they are, what they do, how they want to use it. With that said, that's why I've engaged at like higher levels too and having it in the IHF or, trying to make some of it publicly available or tweet about it, and you could guess how much we do in the men's hockey side, but I feel for women, like we were talking about before, there's like that appetite to learn more. So try to make as much public as you can. And anytime any of you post something, I feel like I get energy and I learn from it too. So I really appreciate all the work in the sphere. But it certainly is a struggle, right? In between, you know, what very rich organizations and people can afford and making sure people have, you know, the same access and to be able to develop as a player or as a team.
Yeah, no, I sit there and like, I can list like 5 or 6 different NCAA teams off the top of my head that I know have like tracking, but like I can't talk about it.
Yeah.
There's like the hidden secrets, like everyone knows like, oh, this uni does it and oh, this uni does it. And sometimes, you know, which company even does it kind of thing. It's all very exciting. But like, even if you do get access to the data, like it's still like you maybe get a 1-team sample and then you can't talk about the team. And so it's like, okay, how am I going to present this in a way that is completely de-identified? Because by the time you de-identify it, there's a potential you lose all meaning in the data because you're like, here's some numbers. No, I can't tell you what they're from or what they mean or what they relate to. And just really trying to balance doing publicly accessible work that kind of shows people like, hey, women's hockey is here and you should get involved with it, while also, you know, trying to like help teams and, you know, really convince teams that investing in this is a good idea.
Yeah, oh no, go ahead, Carly.
Something I've been like thinking about a lot lately with the public versus private issue is that like I've had the pleasure of only working with public data. So anything I do, and I make it a point to only work with public data so I can like source it back and so that other people can work with it. But the problem with that is like when private organizations like NCAA teams or like Stathletes does something like, you can't make that public. And any innovations you make in terms of like creating stats, discovering, you know, different methods of analyzing a game, like you can't share that. And I think it holds the analytics side back because like us out in the public sphere, we just have no idea what's being done anywhere, right? So I'm always like trolling Twitter for like who is doing women's stats and who's posting something just so I can keep up with like the latest innovations, because it'll like be a brief blip on the radar and then it's gone, right? So it's so hard to keep track of all the innovations when they're behind closed doors or just appear for a second.
Well, I think that might tie into the. Oh, sorry. Did you want to go, Lisa?
Go, because I'm going to wrap up.
Okay. That kind of what Carly was just saying ties into, I think, this exposure problem we have, right? We, you know, whenever I finish a project and I, you know, make, you know, this giant sheet I've been working on public, and I've made a point to make, you know, I started doing all this because I needed the resource to do my own writing. And I was like, why wouldn't I share this? Especially if people can learn. And also the other part of it was I just spent God knows how many hours on this. I don't want to be the only person who looks at it. But I feel like if we have a couple, like it's like a flare in the middle of the night when I tweet something with my data and everyone looks around and it's like, oh, look, Mike did this, or, oh, look, Carly did some great biz work, or Alyssa has a new tool, or look at there's all this amazing stuff that Mega was able to do, you know, in the Olympics. And then it's just the night again. And women's hockey analytics is just in silence. And I feel like the more we can make it a part of the conversation, like the general hockey analytics conversation, because, you know, hockey is a niche sport. Women's hockey is a niche sport. And then from there you have women's hockey analytics. We're on a really small island, but we can grow that island, I think, when we just make as much noise as possible, you know, for this duration, a prolonged presence, especially on platforms like social media and Twitter, like make people pay attention, make people get invested. Like every time I tweet out a project I'm working on and someone is like, oh, I didn't know you were doing this. And I know they've been following me for years. And I'm like, where have you been? But I think part of it is what Carly said. It's, you know, it's just, you just kind of keep your eyes open on Twitter just in case someone does something. I don't know, maybe we all need like a Slack or something to keep each other posted on what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll have to, but anyway, thank you all for joining in this conversation and this small amount of discourse. I think we've reignited the why did Hockey Canada sleep on Melody Day episode? That is anything to go by. So I am so sorry.
And Team USA on Blake Bolden. Why did they sleep on her?
Please still like me. We will be back in 10 minutes time for the remaining 3 presentations of the night before we move into the trivia hour, but that will be in the ISOLHAC session 3 video, just so I can try and keep them semi-separated. So I will see you all over there.